It began as an ordinary evening for the Mercer family. The kids were tucked safely in bed. Nathan and Jennifer were watching TV. But upstairs, something was happening that in a few minutes would change their lives forever.
Next thing we know, we heard a thud above our head. We thought it was just Travis getting out of his crib, plopped off the side onto the floor. And that's when she sat up and smelled smoke.
A smoldering fire had broken out in the children's room. The baby monitor short-circuited. It burned for 19 minutes without tripping their smoke alarm.
And then I immediately thought, gotta get the kids out, there's a fire. Ran up the stairs, I stopped. And as I'm standing there, I hear a child screaming 2 rooms away from me.
Nathan rushed the stairs trying to get to the children, but he just couldn't get through the thick smoke. And then he had an idea. Their house was a duplex.
So I asked if I could, go through the wall and try to get to the kids. And I went upstairs and went through the wall and got to Travis and pulled him out.
As Nathan was carrying out Travis, the fire department arrived. They found Bradley and managed to get him out. Although the fire burned for less than half an hour, the results were devastating. Both children had burns to more than 40% of their bodies. The prognosis did not look good.
So they took us in to see him, and I couldn't even tell which child was which. They were that burned and distorted.
For days, all the Mercers could do was stay in the hospital and offer what little comfort they could.
The pain medications take the edge off, but they never, never, never make the pain go away. He just couldn't escape. He just had to take it. And then he would reach out to his parents, and his parents were helpless to change everything.
After a few days, a faint ray of hope. The children were doing well enough to be taken off their ventilators. And for the first time in many days, Jennifer and Nathan went home. But within a couple of hours, they got a call. Bradley, their eldest, wasn't doing well.
The reality just hit that this could be it. And it was very, very depressing.
And then that night, he just deteriorated. After a while, he closed his eyes like he was resting, and then we all got real quiet because we thought he was sleeping. And he'd open his eyes back up and look at everybody again, like he was trying to memorize us.
And he died that night?
Very early Saturday morning.
Were you with him?
Yes.
That has to be the most difficult thing a parent ever faces.
It was the hardest 8 hours. Sitting there watching your child die.
Nathan and Jennifer buried Bradley on January 29th, 1993. But their story doesn't end there. They still had one son in critical care at the hospital, and they still had a lot of questions about what happened. Why didn't their smoke detector warn them that there was a fire in their children's room?
The night of the fire, it did not sound until after we had taken the kids out.
No alarm for 19 minutes. So while Travis was recovering, the Mercers decided to get some help. Get some legal help.
Jim Fetterly.
They called in Jim Fetterly, a Minneapolis lawyer who specializes in fire-related litigation.
I've had a long-standing interest in and concerns about the fire safety aspects of ionization detectors. What's the evidence, fire department or otherwise, that we're going to...
Fetterly believed the Mercers were the right case to demonstrate what some engineers had known for a long time. The majority of smoke detectors sold today do not detect the type of fire that is most likely to kill you. Most smoke detectors work on a principle called ionization. A current of ions flows between two metal plates. When smoke particles enter the chamber, the flow is interrupted, and the alarm is triggered. By now you might be thinking that you're okay because when you burn toast in your kitchen, what happens? The smoke detector goes off. And that must mean that everything's fine and that you're safe. Well, think again. Toast and kitchen smoke generally produce lots of small particles, just the right combination to block the flow of ions. But smoke particles from, say, a fire on your average couch are large and few in number, and they often don't interrupt the flow, and so the alarm doesn't sound. And that's what happened to the Mercers. A smoldering fire broke out in the children's room, and the detector did not sound.
We had a fire progressing for 17 to 20 minutes, and in the interim, literally filling the entire upstairs area with smoke.
The Mercers lived in Davenport, Iowa. That's where Fetterly launched the lawsuit at the local county court. They named Pitway and BRK, the largest manufacturers of smoke detectors in the world, and the makers of First Alert alarms. What came out in court was an astounding tale of misinformation and deception.
This company, from the beginning of its manufacture of an ionization detector, received, by their records, almost weekly, a report of a real-world fire by a consumer in which their detector did not timely sound an alarm.
Judge David Schoenthaler agreed. He found that First Alert did more than ignore the problems with its detectors. It actually covered them up. And the judge went on to say, a smoke detector that sounds approximately 19 minutes after smoke reached its sensing chamber is like an airbag that does not deploy until 19 minutes after a car accident. On May 27, 1998, the judge found the manufacturers guilty and awarded the Mercers nearly $20 million. The decision is currently under appeal. We've just seen the Mercer family tragedy. They lost a son and have another one scarred for life after their smoke detector failed to warn them of a fire. Now, the judge in that case concluded that the company that made the smoke detector had plenty of evidence that it would not work in a smoldering fire, and that it decided not to warn the public.
He's progressing wonderfully since we've left the hospital.
The Mercer case isn't the only legal battle the makers of First Alert are fighting in the United States. A class action suit was just launched in Illinois that could be worth $500 million. There's also another case in St. Louis. In July of this year, a jury awarded Timothy and Mary Gordon $50 million because two of their children died when their First Alert detector failed to warn them of a fire. And though the money being handed out is impressive, the information being revealed in these trials is even more interesting. There may be other reasons that your detector won't save your life. It all started with a phone call. Lawyers for the couple in St. Louis started getting anonymous calls from a former employee of First Alert hinting that they were on the right track. Eventually, the lawyers traced the man and took him to this motel and videotaped this deposition from him.
I do.
David Minnis was an engineering technician who worked for First Alert for 13 years. He claimed the company rigged their alarms to pass safety checks. All smoke alarms are tested in the United States by Underwriters Laboratories. In the late 1980s, First Alert detectors were failing those tests. Their horns were rusting and not making any noise. Minnis testified that First Alert asked for a retest.
This time I was to put 1 drop of contact lubricant on each of the horn contacts.
Minnis claimed that he was told to take the alarms that were going to be tested and put a drop of oil on each of the horns. Well, that stopped the rusting, but only on the detectors being sent to Underwriters Laboratories, not on the ones being sold to the public. And when Minnis complained,
I wanted to keep my job. I was just shut up and do as I was told.
He specifically said those words, you can recall?
Minnis also testified that First Alert interfered with smoke detector testing in Canada. Again, in the late 1980s, First Alert detectors were being failed by our testing agency, Underwriters Laboratories of Canada.
That they, in fact, were sending units up there knowingly that were not to the sensitivity limits of Underwriters Laboratories of Canada.
So many First Alert alarms failed, according to the Minnis deposition, that our federal government was on the verge of issuing a recall. He says instead of fixing the problem,
but I suggested that we question the way that The fire tests are being conducted.
So what happened as a result of your suggestion?
They redid the tests, and enough units passed to cloud the issue.
And what was our government doing while all this was going on? Well, we asked, but they wouldn't tell us. And so we filed a request under the Access to Information Act. And what we discovered was that the government was well aware of the First Alert failures. And despite the fact that selling detectors that couldn't pass the ULC standards was against the law, the government and First Alert would only agree to a partial recall to those detectors that were in the warehouse, not the ones that are in your home. Why? Well, they thought that a full recall would simply cost the company too much money. In fact, it seemed to be tough to get straight answers from anyone about your alarms. And so W5 decided to conduct our own tests on the detectors in Canadian homes. Do they really work? First, we surveyed hardware chains right across the country, made a list of most detectors being sold, and then, following clear instructions set out by a testing lab, we went out to buy 11 different models of detectors representing the two major manufacturers, First Alert and North American Detectors. Microprofile, Fire Sentry. We bought 3 of each, sealed 1 of each model in a box as a control group. The others were shipped to one of the world's leading testing labs for smoke detectors. That lab is located here at Texas A&M University, just north of Houston. It's run by this man, Dr. Don Russell, a PhD in electrical engineering, the Associate Vice Chancellor of the Engineering Department at the university, and one of the world's leading experts on smoke detectors.
The public believes that by buying a common smoke detector off the shelf, that before their house was filled with smoke, that detector would sound and give them a warning. I think they believe that. That's not what will happen. It is absolutely not what will happen. There's 2 of each on each one.
In order to ensure that the tests were done properly, we also flew in another leading expert on smoke detectors to observe the testing. The Chief Fire Marshal of Boston, Joseph Fleming.
She woke up, sat up in bed, smoke was down on the floor.
Fleming sees smoke detector problems from the perspective of a man who has stood on the fire line. He also advises the Consumer Product Safety Commission in the United States on standards for smoke alarms.
We have had cases, in an extreme example of a high-rise where the smoke traveled several floors, where they needed masks and they could not see their hand in front of their face. That's how thick the smoke was, and yet the ionization detectors on those floors were not operating.
The kinds of detectors we're testing today are ionization detectors. They're the most common type, the ones that you're likely to have in your house. First, Russell's lab assistants mount the detectors on the ceiling of the test house. Each detector is hooked up to a sensor, which will tell the computer exactly when the alarm sounds.
Got it.
The detectors are also surrounded by light sensors, which will tell the computer how thick the smoke is. In technical terms, it's called the obscurity level. The Canadian standards at which alarms must sound during a smoldering fire is 6% obscurity.
Okay, we ready to start? Instrumentation is clear and the obscuration is calibrated, right? Correct.
When everything is set, the experiment begins.
We got 15 minutes into the test that we're running on the sofa cushion. We've got a lot of smoke at the ceiling level. The whole room is starting to fill with a substantial amount of smoke.
And we're at what, the ceiling, we're at what level? What percent?
13%. They should have all alarmed by now.
I don't hear anything.
I don't hear anything either.
15 minutes, and not a single detector goes off. Remember, the Canadian standard says they should be going off when the smoke reaches a level of 6%. Well, we're way beyond that level. In fact, we're at nearly 3 times that level, and still, there's nothing.
I've been testing smoke detectors for several years, and it's a very repeatable situation. You can take a couch, you can set a smoldering fire, you wait for an hour or 2, and you may, an hour and a half into the test, not a single smoke detector has gone off.
11 detectors, all sitting within 15 feet of a smoldering fire, and not one of them passed the basic standard set out by our national testing agencies. Just to make sure, we run the tests 3 more times. During one test, smoke pours off the burning couch for more than an hour and 20 minutes. Of the 4 complete tests that we ran, here are the results. In 3 out of 4 tests, there was a 100% failure rate. The results now of W5's independent testing of smoke detectors. Of the 11 major brands and models sold in Canada, not one of them passed all the tests. In 3 out of 4 smoldering fires, no alarm sounded at the level required by the federal government. That's a 75% failure rate, even for the best ones. 3 detectors, the Code 1 Model 2000 and the FireX, both made by Sunbeam, and the Fire Sentry, made by a smaller company called Kitty, failed all of our tests. 3 models of First Alert detectors and 1 Family Guard smoke detector, all brands made by Sunbeam, failed 3 out of 4 tests. And smoke alarms made by North American detectors under the American Sensor, Defender, and Garrison brand names also failed 75% of our tests. And while that circus continues, your safety is left as a game of chance. A game that Travis Mercer and his family lost. Travis Mercer is now 8 years old.
There, we got a hungry one.
And while Travis's life has returned to some semblance of normality, the Mercers will never be the same.
After going through these court cases, we dealt with a few big companies, and we noticed that all of them are hiding and sneaking and keeping things from the public that the public needs to know about in order to remain safe.
They try to brush things under the rug and hopefully that they'll just disappear.
But some things just never disappear.
I made a promise to Bradley when he died that he'd always be in my heart. And he is.